Welcome back with me, Melissa Ong. The G20 summit wrapped up on Sunday with world leaders calling for fairer global trade rules and stronger economic cooperation. But how much real progress was made, especially as geopolitical tensions continue to reshape supply chains and, of course, global markets? Today, we break down the key outcomes of the summit and what they could mean for the global economy. Dr. DEBORAH ELMS, Head of Trade Policy at the Hinrich Foundation, joins us from Singapore. DEBORAH, thanks for doing this. And I'd like to begin with this. Now, the G20 produced a long list of commitments this year. For viewers trying to understand perhaps a bigger picture, what were the most meaningful outcomes for global trade?
I think instead of looking at the long document, as you mentioned, the bigger thing to me out of the G20 is, first of all, that it happened. And second, that they produced a statement at all. Now, both of those things were in real doubt because one of the primary backers of the G20, the United States, declared early on that they would not be attending the summit at all. They would not be sending anyone at any level to attend the summit, and that they would not support any statement that was being released by the G20. And so the expectations were that the summit itself may not happen or may happen in a disrupted fashion, and that no statement would get released. So to me, the bigger issues, rather than what's in the statement, is the fact that they met. It appeared to go quite well, actually, and that they were able to produce a very long list of deliverables, I think is a sign that the rest of the world is thinking about how can the other G20 members work together.
Right, and one of the key themes was narrowing trade inequities between richer and, of course, poorer nations. Now, from your perspective, how serious were G20 leaders about addressing these long-standing gaps?
Well, I think it's always difficult to talk about equality or equity, inclusion, diversity. These kinds of issues are important, just to be clear. They are super important, and that gap between the rich and poor is going to create problems for the G20 countries for some period of time to come. I think the problem is that in the wake of or in the face of real geopolitical tensions, the likes of which, again, almost disrupted and derailed the entire event, it's harder to focus on the gaps between rich and poor because the urgency is to address how will we, the remaining members of the G20 or the larger economic community, come together in the face of this kind of economic pressures from the US and from others in the system.
Right, and of course, the global economy is increasingly shaped by geopolitical rivalry and also fragmented supply chains. Now, did the G20 offer any practical steps to help reduce that fragmentation?
Well, I think one thing the G20 did that is important, and it rides in the wake of a number of actions that Asian countries made over the rest of this month, is they reinforced the importance of the world trading system as the center of the multilateral trading system. That's a statement that we often get in these kinds of summit, leader statements at the end. You can kind of dismiss it as yet another statement that's supporting the WTO. But I think at this time, it's actually more important than ever to have leaders of as many places reinforce their commitment to solving problems through the multilateral trading system. I think it's significant that the G20 took place in South Africa because one of the obstacles to getting anything done at the World Trade Organization has actually been South Africa. So if South Africa were to release its objections from the institution moving forward, we might potentially get much further in the multilateral trading system than we were prior to this G20 summit.
Now let's shift our focus to the digital trade now, which of course underpins almost every modern industry. Yet global rules remain unclear. Did the summit make any real progress on setting standards or perhaps improving digital trade governance?
I think progress there is going to be limited, and this is one of those challenges where if the Americans are not present, given their dominance in many of the digital platforms, digital services, digital designs and regulatory policies, I think it's hard to make forward progress if the Americans are not there or are not participating. However, I think it's still worthwhile for other members of the G20 to sit together and say, how are we managing digital trade? What options do we have on the table? And especially crucially, talk to each other. What are you doing or what are you worried about? How are you preparing to handle this in your domestic markets? I think that is always an important outcome of these kinds of summits that is hard to point to. And journalists don't like it because there's not a big fancy deliverable at the end. But actually, this ability to gather together and to have conversations like, where are you going to go on digital? What are the regulatory areas you're worried about? Is more urgent now than ever.
Now, Deborah, some observers say the G20 is losing influence as major countries prioritize domestic issues. Based on what you saw this year, how effective is the G20 as a platform for economic coordination today?
I don't think anyone really thought that the G20 drove policy decisions. But what the G20 does do, as with many of these kinds of organizations, is it provides an opportunity for leaders to get together. And that is not a small problem. That's actually very important. You need to have, in this case, the heads of 20 largest economies meet regularly to be able to share their experiences and to think about where are we going to go from here. I think that's important anyways. And of course, now it's more urgent than ever. Are they going to actually be able to commit to and follow through on much of anything? No. But I think that sharing of experiences is very important. And also, I think it's useful to have an organization that is already set up so that in times of crisis, that you have already the connections, the links, the platform in which to pick up the phone and call one another, potentially convene meetings. I think that is extremely valuable. So it's both regular, routine, ongoing work that matters, but also times of crisis. You need to have past experiences working together in this environment in order to facilitate whatever kind of collective response might be necessary in a time of crisis.
Now let's bring it back to Malaysia or perhaps Singapore, which raised concerns about fairer global trade rules. What should Malaysians or countries in Southeast Asia understand about where their country fits in this shifting global dynamics?
It's a very uneven and uncomfortable balance at this point for a place like Malaysia or Singapore or most of Southeast Asia, which is that, you have traditionally straddled the line between what the United States wants, say, and what China wants, what Europe wants, three big players. They have generally, although not always, they've kind of moved in the same basic direction. It's been a lot easier to deal with all three of them. But now, if they are moving in opposite directions or contradictory positions, it is much harder to have that sort of balance in place. And you've seen that certainly for Malaysia as host of APEC this last year, trying to navigate that sort of difficulty of ASEAN this year, trying to navigate that difficulty between how should the region and how should Malaysia specifically manage the tensions of demands from the US with tensions from demands of other Malaysian and or ASEAN trading partners. I think Malaysia did actually a pretty good job of trying to keep the options on the table open, friendly to all. But that's going to get very difficult going forward if we see more fragmentation in our future from 2026 and beyond.
Well, we have to watch and see, but that's all the time we have. Thank you for weighing in your thoughts, Deborah.
Thank you.